Fantastic. So, Camela, welcome. So excited. Feels like the old days when we were be on each other's podcast when we needed a guest in a pinch.
Yes, indeed.
So
Although I didn't know you just used me to fill in. That's great, Doug.
all right, for the poor person having to write this article, excuse that opening. So let's get started. Camela, I want to start with grounding our audience in the idea of a DIY model. So, I'm sort of going to give you the core of what I think it is. Then I want you to sort of unpack the rest for us. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So for me, and you're the expert, but for me, an attribution model is ultimately a set of rules that a marketer uses to determine how to score marketing activities towards some other goal, conversions, pipeline, revenue, what have you. So that's an attribution model at its simplest form. Okay.
I see it.
How would you describe it?
Oh, I see it used in a couple ways. I think the traditional definition is using a mathematical model to figure out which campaigns work and which do not. So I think in its purest form, it was really intended as campaign optimization. And there are a lot of consultants out there who will die on that hill and say that that's what it should be, period. Where I kind of flinch and shake my head a little bit is I see a lot of leaders and a lot of the C-suite and board members really pushing on marketing leaders to provide an estimate of the department's efforts versus other go-to-market departments. And that involves a lot more than campaign activity. And a lot of people think that that's not what attribution should be. However, it's what I see a lot of people trying to use attribution for.
Which I think relates really well to our topic today.
Yep.
Right? And what we're talking about is why people tend to over-engineer their DIY models. I mean, that's on some level speaking to that. And I think you bring up a really interesting point, which I want to emphasize, which is there is no such thing as a go-to-market model that is entirely derived from and or driven by a single department.
Right.
And so that complexity is quite often driven by the fact that, say, how you're showing up with your product-led growth model, how your sellers are showing up, how other areas of the business are showing up. That's really, I think, what you're speaking to, right? Driving
Exactly.
complexity.
Exactly. It's like a three-legged stool. You've got ops at the top and then sales, marketing, and CS. And if any of those are weak, the stool falls over because it doesn't have a leg. So absolutely, you can't have a successful business with weaknesses in those areas.
And the complexity driver you're speaking about as well, in many ways, is that people ask way too much of those models themselves,
Yes.
whether or not it's installed software or a model they're building themselves.
Right. And I think it's fundamentally a lack of trust in the numbers marketers traditionally turn to because they're not very understood and it's hard to correlate them to what the business really cares about, which is pipeline and revenue. So I have a lot of people asking me, how do I prove my digital marketing works? When you think about digital advertising, it's really a fantastic way to drive awareness and reach. It's not a great way to immediately funnel in a bunch of opportunities. So it's really difficult to do what the business is asking for, and find a model that bridges that lack of trust issue that's really at the heart of everything.
Okay. So I understand trust,
Mhm.
and whether or not marketers have earned that lack of trust over time, whether it's deserved or not, it exists. And I think we have to acknowledge it.
Right.
I'm wondering, Camela, how you think about skills gaps potentially with marketers as well, and their ability both to surface the right data and to interpret the data.
Yeah. That's hard. I've seen marketing leaders do it really well, and I've seen marketing leaders do all the wrong things. So I really encourage people to be honest with themselves and know what they don't know, and then hire accordingly. So if you're not super comfortable with numbers and interpreting them, or you can tell there are inconsistencies that are making people uncomfortable, it's time to hire somebody who can really come in and interpret that information for you. I don't think it's bad to rely on another resource as long as you know that's what you need to do. If you're not honest with yourself and you try to bluff your way through it, it's not acceptable anymore. I think as time goes on, other business leaders really expect marketing to fall in line with the other departments who have a proven track record of reporting the same metrics across companies. And we just don't have that yet for marketers. I think we can get there, but it's going to take some time.
I have to bring up, I think, by the way, thank you. I think it's a really good summary of and good advice for folks that are out there experiencing those gaps. Traditionally, marketers actually are pretty analytical folks. I think we undersell that capability, but this really helps me transition over to my next topic, which is you're only as good as the data and the data hierarchies and the way that you organize that data. You can be the best analyst, you can be the best pattern matcher, you can be the most amazing marketer. So talk to me a bit about that in the context of DIY models. Do you think that DIY models ultimately are putting people in a better position to solve for their problems, or they're still at the same time, they're just dragging that along with them?
It's so difficult to wrangle that data and present it in a way that the rest of the business understands. It's really important to ask a lot of questions and be honest about what you don't know and figure out how the other departments are defining things before running forward with a deck and a presentation. And one of the top mistakes I hope other marketing leaders listening to this avoid is to, when you first get into an organization, figure out what kind of metrics are being reported on today before you sign up for KPIs. Because I've seen a lot of folks not know that certain things weren't being measured, sign up for something and then not be able to prove it. So absolutely putting the foundation in place and really having that data in shape and good enough to be translated is difficult. However, I think we have so much data that we're drowning in it, and we can do a lot with what we have if we know how. It's just a matter of accepting it's not going to be perfect, and then being able to speak to that in a way that the executive team is comfortable with. That's the hard thing.
And further, what you're saying is don't assume that you have the right data sets before you agree to those goal sets. In other words, can you measure leading and trailing activities to actually know whether you're going to hit those numbers or not? I think it's a great point.
Right. If you say, I'm going to double marketing pipeline, make sure that your business has an attribution model and a way to measure marketing source pipeline in a way you agree with.
Camela, I got to tell you, I've been a marketer since 2004. So let me do the math. That's almost 20 years. And I tell you, I stepped in that recently. That assumption cycle you get into, because I think you and I demand that we have data that allows us to understand and be performant. And we sometimes can easily just assume. Now, this is RevOps 101, right? Get the data right first. But I've stepped in it recently. It's an easy trap to fall into, to assume that the data is organized in the way that you need it to. And I have to tell you, I feel like it's 80% of the market that's not in that place. So as we're thinking about DIY models, let's keep that in mind. It's not the beauty of your mathematical formula. It's also the efficacy of your data and your ability to use it, present it to management.
Exactly.
Okay. I want to give a little more scale for folks in terms of, let's give the range of DIY models. Okay. And so I'll give the simplest, you're going to give the most complex, because that's just our relationship. I do the simple, you do complex. Ready?
I don't know if I agree with that, but go ahead.
Okay. Here we go. Here's the Doug version. I see the most common DIY model typically as somebody downloading opportunity object data into a spreadsheet and running first and last touch pivots against that with some really basic formulas. And then I've seen that make it up into board decks for public companies. By the way, I'll mention the name of the company.
Yeah.
So, by the way, so folks, it is real that this is happening casually, even for bigger companies. So that's sort of the bottom of the scale. What would you put at the top? Like, what's the most sophisticated DIY models that you run into?
I mean, if I'm being flip, it would be CaliberMind, but I'm totally honest. I think organizations that try to do it themselves, you have some kind of data repository, whether it's a data lake or a data warehouse. You have integrations that are automated to core systems, all of your core systems. You have data mapping in place that makes sure those systems speak the same language. And anytime you change a tool, it's going to take a long time to map that data and integrate it into your models. And then your models are going to be written on top of that. I think where things can get really complex are the models themselves. And I've seen everything from regression analysis to machine learning. So it just, it depends on the organization, the skill sets there, but that's probably the most sophisticated, although I've seen it fail quite a few times for various reasons.
Okay. So I get the structure. We're talking about data warehouse, data lake. We've got a reporting layer on that, call it what you will, but there's a marketing analytics at a minimum, a BI layer on top of it.
Yep.
You have got really good solid APIs into your existing first and third party data sets. And you've established a really solid data hierarchy.
Yeah, and a data map, which I
And a
think is
data
even
map.
so it's basically functioning, and a lot of B2B organizations build this without knowing it, but it's a customer data platform that's creating a way to consistently identify companies and people, no matter what system you're looking in.
Okay. And then just to make sure we're all understanding what we're talking about, we also have to have the ability to weight impact. In other words, we have to create an underlying attribution model that interprets that data map and data hierarchy based on activity. And we're sort of coding that in at some point. It's probably a Java layer that we're building potentially with a query layer. Is that about right?
I mean, it could be done in SQL, Python. There's a lot of query languages that can be used, but the main, and machine learning models that can be used too. I think the main things that are usually decided on are if there are any particular key points in time that need to be weighed more heavily, or people. So there's a weighting component, and then there's also a timeline. So how many days before the opportunity is opened is an activity eligible, and are we going until the opportunity is closed, or what's the time frame we're really trying to analyze?
Right. So we've got, as you said, the timeline, replacing event activities on that timeline so we can associate with the data, with the map, with the hierarchy. You're using queries to come and say, okay, this is what I think it should be. And then you're using W shape, middle weight, first touch, last touch models to peel and re-understand. Because guess what, folks? To understand that data, you can't just use one attribution formula or model. You've got to use multiple to understand what's going on. Do I have that right?
I would say yes, although I think some people try to use one. I think a lot of them answer different questions. So the simplest models that you mentioned initially, first touch is really good at figuring out what first draws people to interact with your brand. Middle touch is great at understanding what gets people to actually talk to your sales team. And then I feel like multi-touch is a good way to understand what works in between. So we're talking about weighting, timeline, but we're also talking about which touch points are we including. And it gets complicated really fast.
My head is spinning, and this is what we do for a living, right? So,
Yes.
okay. By the way, have we done this? I think we've done this perfectly. The Doug model is you download stuff into a spreadsheet. Camela just unpacked, right? Really what typically these DIY models are, especially for larger organizations, right? It's a lot. Okay, good. Now let's talk about you actually started leaning into this a little bit, but ultimately we're trying to talk about is why people over engineer their DIY models. So when we talked earlier, you talked about a bunch of stuff. You talked about over engineering coming because there are too many iterations. You talked about it because they're hitting the edge of their own capabilities, analytical capabilities. The leadership team starts giving up because they don't trust the numbers.
Yeah.
And you also talked about RevTech stack turnover. All right, so we have our 4 areas that tend to lead to complexity. You want to start with too many iterations in the model itself? Talk to us about that.
Yeah. I think fundamentally, trust is at the center of everything. So what I mean by that is our executive is under a ton of pressure from the board to prove certain things that are hard to prove. And that big one is how are you contributing to our pipeline and bookings or revenue? They want to understand if marketing is putting in as much or more effort as the other go-to-market teams, so they can identify if and where they have an issue. And that's really hard for marketers for a lot of reasons, one of which being we should be touching every part of the funnel and interacting with people throughout, because a lot of people are, they're doing all the research online, they're interacting with us. I think, when things start to get complicated, I start asking why we're not happy with what we're doing now. And when I'm asking that, a lot of times the reason why we're not happy with what we're doing now is because we're trying to use the model in a way in which it was not built to support.
Say more about that. What do you mean?
So
How are we stretching it? How are we stretching it in the wrong direction?
I think a lot of operations people see attribution as a tool to optimize campaigns. And it's really good at that. It's absolutely good at that. We're trying to figure out which things people are interacting with the most. And we want to tie it to pipeline and bookings because we know the rest of the business cares about that. The leadership team knows that sales has a huge part in whether or not deals close. And it doesn't make sense to them to say marketing should get credit. And I know that's the word we hate in attribution, but marketing should get credit for 100% of the sale. And we should look at what marketing's doing and allocate dollars that way. And I think a lot of this comes to customer acquisition cost and how the business really defines how we look at spend efficiency. It's never solely a marketing equation. We look at the combination of efforts between marketing and sales. So I think a lot of times marketers look at this as a project that they're going to take on and they're going to implement, and then they try to present it to the rest of the company. And the sales leader is the first one to jump up and call BS because they know that their team put a lot of effort into these sales and they're not being represented in those numbers.
And it turns into a food fight.
Every time.
So I'm going to back through and talk about the core elements here that turn into the complexities we're ultimately wanting to unpack today. Camela, what you're saying is there is a lack of trust in the numbers, not always necessarily because of data hygiene, hierarchy, mapping issue, but because they're being presented by the very people setting the rules and creating the scoring. If you
Correct.
will.
Correct.
So that is the marketing org.
And it's rarely a cross-functional project to implement attribution.
So it is presupposed that bias is built in.
Exactly. So if we're to flip things around and work with sales management and finance on how they define things and what they would find fair, or if we were to position attribution strictly as a marketing efficiency tool and not an attempt to figure out ROI or budgeting, those are kind of our choices. And I don't see them navigated well today, and I think it's fixable.
But we need to make, I mean, this is a call to action for the industry, and I think we've been hearing this quite a bit. This is nothing new, but maybe the endpoint is different, Camela, which is to say the call to action is let's stop trying to score and let's start trying to make better decisions. Let's lean into this in terms of our ability to get the data we need, the information we need to make good decisions. Does that solve the complexity cycle? Like, are we at the end of this interview because we've ended that complexity cycle because we've said, think about what you're delivering differently. This is about making good investment decisions as opposed to justifying past activity. Does that take away the tendency towards complexity?
It goes a long way in it, but I think we need to acknowledge that what the board and leadership team really wants is a demonstration of effort between go-to-market teams. So if we just say this is a marketing tool and we're using it to figure out campaign optimization, your CMO is still going to get hammered over the head to provide some kind of estimate. So we can either use attribution and expand its uses to include activity from other departments and view this as a cross-functional initiative, or we can start all over at the drawing board and figure out a different way to do it.
Okay. I think that's up to us in the industry, and we're going to ask the people reading this article or listening to this conversation today to pull that up. I'm looking at you and I and others in the industry to make that happen. I think AI is going to be a big part of that. I think ultimately AI is in the hype cycle, as we understand. It's going to hit its valley of distrust as well. But we know where attribution is, really. It's in that valley of distrust, right? It's not widely adapted as being a standard.
Well, and
And
we're
it's something
selling it as something that it's not, right? It was originally sold as the silver bullet that can do everything in an absolute, and it is at best an estimate. So I think it was never really positioned as it was intended to be used. I still think it's highly useful. I still want it wherever I go because I know I can make some really great decisions based on it. I just, I know how I need to position it and talk to my leadership team about it. And that is highly dependent on what they want to see and what they're willing to accept in terms of uncertainty, because it's an estimate.
I want to get back to um, sort of the drivers of complexity. And I want to put one to bed right away because I think there's no way to avoid it. So we talked about too many iterations. We talked about hitting the edge of your analyst abilities. We talked about leadership giving up. We spent quite a bit of time on that when it comes to attribution altogether. And then RevTech stack turnover, say that 5 times fast. I feel like we can put the too many iterations to bed because ultimately you're having to constantly iterate in order to, and this is, by the way, I think this is classic DIY models, right? Yep. You are constantly iterating. It is not set up to be fluid and flexible. So it is what it is. You're not going to stop iterating.
I would say, though, if you're iterating significantly, like if you're going from logarithmic to even weighted to time decay, you are asking the wrong questions and solving things incorrectly. If people don't trust your data, it's because it doesn't fit the approach they want to use it for.
So you've got to be asking why the iterations. Are you iterating to trust? That's the slippery slope. If you're iterating to better decisions, again, let's use that rubric. We created it on the show. Then that's fine, right? You're trying to find a way to get better decisions. But if it's ultimately about one more iteration to justify X, Y, or Z, in this case, spending, credit, whatever, bad. You're going to create unnecessary complexity and not get a better result.
Right. If it's so we can show it to the sales team and they'll agree, or if we can show it to finance, or if we can show it to fill in the blank, any type of complexity you're putting in there is not going to solve the problem.
Okay. We talked about this a little earlier. I want to come back to it because I feel like this is sort of the hidden challenge ultimately. And it's true for the leaders, it's true for the managers, it's true for the operators. But I feel like we're constantly bumping up against the edge of our capabilities as marketers to understand the data we're put in front of. You said it very clearly. We're awash in data.
Yeah.
I would actually take that a little further, and I would say we're awash in data silos.
Yeah.
And I recently had this really fun walkthrough with the CEO of a company who said, "How do you understand and interpret data?" And this person spent an hour and a half with me going through and seeing how I went from data silo to data silo to data silo and back. And by the way, in some of the best tools that are out there, we have this great privilege of having exposure to amazing data sets and amazing tools. And this person was like, "Oh, this is unbelievable. This is the data." I'm like, "This is the daily." Yeah, it's the daily. So I just we're awash in those silos. And the one thing I look to from an attribution standpoint, whether it's a DIY model, but I highly recommend you graduate at some point to an out-of-the-box model. Because I look at these things, what I typically come back to is your DIY model will be customized to the agenda of the person who's designing and delivering it, which is really, I think, the point you're making.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas if you're deploying, and again, folks, look, you're going to decide to do DIY or not, no matter what Camela and I say. But I would say when you're starting to see complexity rise and the answers, the point of diminishing returns with your DIY model, you got to start about thinking about standardization, because ultimately you stop going down that incredible slippery slope. Yep. And it is glorious to have that data set and not have to dance between applications to make decisions. Or off my soapbox, analyst abilities, hitting the edge of that. Is it possible for a DIY model to overcome your own personal or others' lack of analyst capabilities? You think so?
Yes. So the most success I had with attribution was using the simplest model. So what I found, now I caved and I created something that I collaborated with the sales team, customer success, and finance on. And we talked about which activities from each team should be included to do that departmental representation. Once we landed on that and understood it was an estimate, my life got a lot easier. So, and I used the simplest model possible. Once we agreed on the underlying data points that we were including and how we wanted to use it, and that we were going to accept this estimate, the simplest model to explain was the way I went, because it needs to be easy to understand. I think one of the biggest hurdles I had early on in my attribution career, this is back in like 2014 or earlier, which is considered early. The biggest hurdle I had was getting people to understand attribution, because I think they'd get there just using an even weighted model, and then I'd have them explain it back to me, and it would be completely different than what I said. So really, to me, it's not about the skills of the analyst. That's rarely the issue. I know some people want to do logarithmic machine learning, all these different variations. That's fine. You can get there in much simpler ways if you reach across the aisle and work with your team, if you're trying to do that cross-functional thing. Now, if you're a marketer surely trying to use it for campaign optimization, I don't think it has to be that complicated to figure out whether or not it's working. What you really need to ask yourself is why people are pushing back on it. So I was working with a digital marketer, advertising, and I told them, I don't care about interactions that lead to touches on our website unless it subsequently turns into pipeline. Now that can be way later, but if people hit our site and leave and never convert into an opportunity, I don't care. And they got really upset and said, that's not fair. To me, what the business cares most about is pipeline and bookings. So I want to understand what's doing that. I don't care about overall awareness and visits if they don't eventually convert, because to me, that might be the wrong audience. So you really need to work with your marketing team too, to figure out what it's a psychological, emotional, uncomfortable with, as opposed to, we'll solve this by weighting things more heavily. It really requires an in-depth conversation and really communicating why you're approaching it the way you are. It's a tough conversation to have.
And I love the underlying theory there. And it's funny that your most success was with the simplest attribution model. But by the way, that was also successful because you had alignment across multiple different organizations as well.
Exactly.
With that model heading in. But it's this idea of gravity, and it's this idea of entropy, right? Ultimately, the universe, it's a big bang, but it's going to end in entropy. Everything's just going to float off into space, right? There will be no matter. There'll be matter, but no organization of the matter. I bring that up because that's how I feel when somebody tells me they have an elegant, simple attribution model. Like, you're moments away from entropy. I'm predicting because what happens? You can't answer some of the more complex questions, right? So I feel like that's sort of what drags marketers into, like, I built that too, Camela. I built the simple, elegant model that had heavy alignment. We used the campaign object in Salesforce. We made sure all of our activities were associated with it. And then somebody goes, what about third-party data? I go, oh, yeah, yeah, I got that.
Well, and I'm not saying forsake all other tools and models. Like, attribution has its uses, and I'm still going to be using Ahrefs or SEMrush or whatever. Like, we still need to be in certain platforms, in certain tools, and making decisions, especially early on in a campaign, that are based on those systems. We're not throwing that out. I'm sorry, but there's not going to be a day where I just log into one dashboard and immediately know how all of my programs are going.
Google just had an aneurysm when you said that, by the way.
Yeah, well, Google's wrong all the time. They're prompt. They do answer.
And they're about ready to hit the most massive antitrust settlement or case in the history of the world. History of the United States.
Watching that.
Very fascinating. Maybe for another interview, I think. So, okay. I'm a linear person, you know that. So I'm going to go through. I'm going to think about everything we just talked about. I'm going to cast it in terms of what drives complexity. You challenged me and said too many iterations are a possibility, or sorry, avoiding iterations are a possibility. I completely disagree. But we're gonna land there.
Okay.
I love the beauty of the simplicity ultimately, but I do think you hit that slippery slope, the idea of entropy. But I get it. I think it's a great tip out there to folks. I'm going to emphasize this. Camela is highly recommended you keep the models as simple as possible. Those are the best models. If that model can't help answer the question, what Camela is saying is go to another system.
Mhm.
Go find the data elsewhere. I think that's a really, really elegant way to think about it. The second piece was hitting the edge of your analytical capabilities. This is where we sort of get back to those questions of iterations, ultimately. Camela, what you were saying there is that actually people are really capable on the analytical side. And to counter what you said before, you possibly are going to have to iterate to be able to get to the point you're overcoming some of those analyst gaps, right? In other words, the more you need to fill those gaps, maybe the more complex your models get.
Well, I think the biggest power an analyst holds is the ability to ask the right questions. So I think a lot of times we're missing the core questions we need to be asking. Who's uncomfortable? Why are they uncomfortable? What do they not like about it? Who's not buying into this? Who's pushing back? Which department is this? What are you trying to use it for? I know that can get annoying really fast, but it's worth it. And I think people should be patient because you're going to come out on the other side with something that's usable.
Okay, that'll make sense. And I think we've spent a lot of time talking about building trust with your stakeholders and the recipients of your data. Let's call that leadership. Okay.
Mhm.
We don't want to lose that trust. Elegant models and simplest models are best there. I agree. We didn't talk about RevTech stack turnover. We haven't talked about that. I feel like that drives tons of complexity. I'll go back to
It
my
does.
campaign object model. And that day I'm like, oh yeah, we can have third-party data. How do we do that? Right. So talk to me about that. How do you sort of avoid that as you're plugging and playing with different applications, or is there no way to avoid it?
I think the only way to avoid it is moving away from a DIY model and working with a vendor that already has the API connections and integrations that you're most likely going to run into. Change is inevitable. We're really susceptible to marketing as marketers. And there's like 10,000 products out there now, something ridiculous. We're going to make changes and we need to have a technology, an attribution technology that's malleable.
Okay, really good point. You're so almost, look, what we're not doing is scolding anybody today. Let's make sure that's
No,
really clear.
no.
90, let's call it as it is. 90+% of the market is deploying a DIY attribution solution.
Yeah. And you're always going to have a job because it is a full-time gig to change the API connections, data mapping, and update the models appropriately.
Oh
So,
gosh, can we just give the tip? Please have a sandbox. Have a corner,
yeah.
please. Sorry, you and I, we need to speak in generalities, but let's use that sandbox, please, folks, before you
Yeah,
do your
don't
API integrations. Yeah.
get the t-shirt and test in production. It's just not good.
QA cycle. Think about it as software development. So, but I feel like we've said, look, let's acknowledge not everybody is going to go plop down what they're going to need to plop down for a full-blown attribution solution. We get that multi-touch attribute. We get it. We understand.
I will
Most of the
say the
market,
irony is, though, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I will say the irony is they're going to spend a lot more with the DIY if they're paying for the data lake, the API connector, the talent, and the time, I would say, wasted on updating everything over and over again.
this is my Camela face, right? This is my Camela. There it is. There's my Camela face. But there's my Camela face, which is to say, we're not going to be scolds, right? We're not being scolds. I would agree. I think you're going to spend just as much. But at the end of the day, look, this is 90% of the market. We want to help people manage through this stuff. That's our job. So I feel like you've given everybody sort of an entry and an exit path. Your entry path is to acknowledge that everybody has a DIY model. If you don't, you're fired. Right? Somebody's fired.
Who is scolding? Who was scolding, Doug?
All right, I've been corrected. Camel's going to correct me here, folks. Remind me to delete the recording of this later on. Okay. But I feel like that entry is to acknowledge, hey, look, everyone's dealing with the DIY model. And I think you're giving people that exit path, which is to say, you are going to get to a point where you are going to create a model that has so much complexity and hits the point of diminishing return that you should really consider bringing on a multi-touch attribution solution. I got to mention this. Please don't be dumb enough. And I said that word intentionally. Please don't be dumb enough to believe that you can put a form on a website and have that be your proxy for attribution people. Wake up
doesn't
and
scale.
smell the BS. Exactly. And by the way, that is just another iteration on the existing de facto DIY model. It is not your model. So those are my concluding statements today. Camela, I always enjoy time with you. I don't like it when people are smarter than me. So thank you for being with me today and outsmarting me as always, Camela.
Thank you for being spicy and calling out the form fill. I just really enjoyed that. It fed my soul. Thank you, Doug.
We're going to make sure that the writer who creates this includes that in there. So, all right,
Oh, heck
always
yeah.
a pleasure. Camela Thompson, welcome. Thank you. Really appreciate your time.